The year is 1854. The location is New York City. A city of dreadful night, teeming with the desperate, the dispossessed, the forgotten. They pour from the coffin ships, fleeing a famine in Ireland, a failed revolution in Germany. They fill the 5 Points, a wretched hive of squalor and disease, and the authorities, the men of wealth and property, look upon this burgeoning, chaotic mass with a mixture of pity and terror. This is the official story. This is the background radiation of the history we are taught. Enter a man named Charles Loring Brace. A minister, a philanthropist, a man with a vision. He sees the thousands of homeless children, the so-called street Arabs, and proposes a solution. A radical, compassionate solution. He will send them west. He will send them to the vast, open heartland of America, to be adopted by good, God-fearing farming families. A chance for a new life. A chance to escape the gutter. He founds the Children's Aid Society. And so, the orphan trains begin their long, slow journey into the sunset, carrying their precious cargo of saved souls. This is the story they tell in textbooks. A story of Victorian charity, of American optimism, of a nation with a heart big enough to rescue its own. It is a lie. Every single word of it is a lie. On a damp, cold-choked morning in September of 1854, a young priest named Father Michael stood on a platform at the since-demolished West 30th Street station. He was there as an observer, a man of God offering a silent blessing to a venture he had been told was a work of profound Christian mercy. He watched the children file onto the waiting cars. He had worked in the 5 Points. He knew the faces of hunger. He knew the gaunt, hollowed-out look of children who had seen too much and eaten too little. He knew their ragged clothes, their matted hair, the singular smell of poverty that clung to them like a shroud. But these were not those children. These children were different. They were clean. Their clothes, though simple, were new and sturdy. Their shoes were unscuffed. They did not cry or cling to one another. They walked in an orderly line, their faces impassive, their eyes holding a strange, unnerving placidity. They were quiet. Too quiet. It was the silence that first pricked the priest's unease. The silence of a congregation, not a playground. They took their seats without squabbling, their gazes fixed forward, as if awaiting a sermon or a command. And the men organizing them. They were not the soft-handed ministers or bustling charity women Father Michael had expected. They were hard men, with square jaws and watchful eyes that missed nothing. They moved with a cold, practiced efficiency, checking names on a list, directing the children with curt, subtle gestures. They carried themselves not like saviors, but like handlers. Like wardens. One of them dropped a sheaf of papers. As the man bent to retrieve it, Father Michael caught a glimpse of the manifest. He expected to see a list of names like O'Malley, Schmidt, or Kowalski. He expected the detritus of the famine and the failed revolutions. Instead, he saw names like Spencer, Davenport, and Harrington. He saw a list of old stock, Anglo-Saxon names. Names that belonged not in the tenements of the 5 Points, but in the brownstones of Boston and the manors of the Hudson Valley. And the destinations listed beside them were not vague descriptions of a good home in the West, they were precise. They were railroad depots in Ohio, counties in Indiana, specific townships in Illinois. Locations that were, at that moment, little more than prairie grass and frontier outposts. The train pulled away, a serpent of smoke and iron, and Father Michael stood frozen on the platform, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He knew, with the certainty of a man who has just seen the face of something ancient and unholy, that he had not just witnessed an act of charity. He had witnessed a deployment. But here's what they don't want you to know. Here is the truth that was buried under a century and a half of manufactured history and philanthropic propaganda. The orphan trains were not an evacuation. They were an invasion. They were not shipping the poorest of the poor out of the cities to give them a new life. They were shipping a new, engineered population into the heartland to replace the one that was already there. This was not a rescue mission. It was the single largest, most covert, and most successful act of social engineering and population replacement in the history of the world. It was a quiet, methodical conquest, orchestrated by the very men we now celebrate as the architects of modern America. Welcome to the story they tried to erase. The story of how the richest families in America didn't build a nation, but usurped one. To understand the sheer audacity of this plan, we must first understand the America of the 1850s. It was a nation seething with a spirit the men of industry and finance found deeply troubling. The descendants of the original pioneers, the farmers, the frontiersmen, they were a stubborn, independent, and fiercely anti-authoritarian people. They were self-sufficient. They answered to no master. They were the inheritors of a revolutionary spirit that valued liberty above all else, a trait utterly incompatible with the new age that was dawning. An age of industry. An age of factories, of railroads, of capital. An age that required not free-thinking individuals, but a compliant, interchangeable workforce. A population that would live where it was told, work where it was told, and think what it was told. The existing American stock was unsuitable. They were ungovernable. So, a decision was made in the fire-lit drawing rooms and exclusive clubs of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. A decision of breathtaking cruelty and ambition. The existing population had to be removed. And a new one had to be put in its place. The evidence for this is not found in the grand, sweeping histories written by the victors. It is found in the margins. In the forgotten archives, the dusty letters, the private journals of those who saw what was happening and were powerless to stop it. Consider the journal of Dr. Alastair Finch, a country physician in the small, thriving settlement of Havenwood, Illinois. His entries, written in a spidery, elegant script, begin in 1855 with the mundane details of a rural practice, births, broken bones, winter fevers. But in the autumn of that year, his tone begins to change. He writes of the arrival of a train. Not a passenger train, but a special charter. It deposited 24 children and a handful of stern-faced guardians who established a small, isolated community on the edge of town. The official story, relayed by the town mayor, was that they were orphans from the East, sponsored by a church charity. The people of Havenwood, good-hearted pioneers, welcomed them. Dr. Finch was called to examine the children. His journal entry for October 12, 1855, is telling. "I was summoned to the new settlement today," he wrote. "I expected to find the usual afflictions of the institutionalized child, malnutrition, rickets, lice. I found nothing of the sort. These are the healthiest children I have ever seen. Their physical development is remarkable, almost precocious. Yet there is a strange lack of affect about them. They answered my questions in monotone, without emotion. They do not play. They perform chores with a silent, unnerving efficiency. It is as if they are not children at all, but small adults in the bodies of youths." His unease grew. Over the next 2 years, his journal becomes a chronicle of a town slowly dying. A strange sickness began to move through Havenwood in the spring of 1856. It started with a profound lethargy, followed by a low-grade fever and disorientation. It was not influenza. It was not cholera. It was something he had never seen. And it was strangely selective. It only afflicted the original families. The founding stock of Havenwood. The orphans and their guardians remained untouched, living in their isolated compound, drinking only from their own private, newly dug well. November 1856, Finch wrote, his handwriting becoming more frantic. "The Miller family is gone. All 6 of them. The Cartwrights, who founded our town, are buried behind the church. The sickness is a ghost, it takes the old blood and leaves the new. I have sent water samples to Chicago for analysis. I have received no reply. I suspect the wells. I have warned the mayor, but he is one of them now. He dines with the guardians. His own children are sick, yet he does nothing." His final entry, dated January 4, 1857, was scrawled on a loose page, tucked into the back of the journal. "They are not children. They do not age as we do. They learn with an unnatural speed. The guardians are teaching them engineering, finance, law. The old families are gone. All gone. The town is silent but for them. I believe I am the last. My cough is worse. The water. It was the water. They are inheriting a graveyard. Dr. Alastair Finch was found dead 2 days later. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia. His journal, saved by a suspicious relative, tells a different story. It tells the story of a replacement. This was not an isolated incident. This was the blueprint. They say a swift and brutal fever took the town of Prairie's End, Kansas in 1858, wiping out nearly 80% of its founding population in a single season. They don't mention that a trainload of orphans had arrived 6 months prior. They say it was a series of crop failures and a harsh winter that entered the Valley of Prosperity, Indiana, between 1860 and 1862. They don't mention the charity that bought up all the failed farms for pennies on the dollar and settled them with the adolescent graduates of the orphan program. They say it was cholera, dysentery, influenza. They say it was bad luck, the harsh reality of frontier life. They are lying. In town after town, across the entire Midwest, the pattern repeated itself with chilling precision. First, the arrival of the train. Then, the establishment of a separate, disciplined community of orphans and their handlers. Then, a mysterious, targeted plague that decimated the original population. And finally, the quiet, orderly absorption of the vacant land, the empty homes, the silent businesses by the new arrivals. The evidence was even hiding in plain sight, in the newspapers of the day, before the narrative was fully controlled. The Omaha Daily Herald, in 1871 published a small, curious article on page 4. It noted the remarkable uniformity of development in several new counties in Nebraska. It is as if, the reporter wrote, these towns were not grown, but manufactured. The families, all of a similar stock and arriving within the same few years, seemed to operate with a singular purpose, their civic and economic life organized with a military precision unseen in older, more chaotic settlements. The paper was bought by an East Coast consortium a month later. The editor was fired, and its archives were subsequently lost in a fire. A United States census taker in 1870, a man named Silas Kane, submitted a supplementary report to his superiors that should have shaken the nation. Working in rural Ohio, he meticulously documented the demographic data and found what he called a statistical impossibility: entire family lines, present and accounted for in the 1850 and 1860 censuses, had simply vanished. Not moved away, he checked records in neighboring states, but disappeared entirely. In their place were new names, hundreds of them, who all listed their place of birth as New York or Pennsylvania, yet had no discernible family history prior to their arrival in Ohio in the late 1850s. Kane wrote in his report, "It is as if a generational slate was wiped clean in this territory over the course of a single decade. The genealogical lines of the pioneers who settled this land have been severed. In their place stands a new population, whose roots are shallow and whose origins are, upon investigation, deliberately obscure." His report was buried. The official census summary dismissed his findings as anomalous data resulting from poor record-keeping in frontier territories. Silas Kane was reassigned to a remote outpost in the Dakota Territory and was never heard from again. The suppression was not just bureaucratic. It was academic. In the 1920s, a brilliant and tenacious sociologist at the University of Chicago, a woman named Ilara Vance, stumbled upon these same discrepancies. Using more advanced statistical methods, she began a massive genealogical project, tracing the family histories of the most prominent families in the Midwest, the families that now ran the banks, the factories, the railroads. She expected to trace them back to the pioneers. Instead, she found a wall. A wall that stood around the year 1855. Time and time again, her research led back to a single, impossible origin point: an orphan who arrived on a train. A foundling with no past. She discovered that nearly 70% of the region's industrial and financial elite were descended not from the rugged individuals who settled the prairie, but from these mysterious children. It was a demographic coup d'etat. Vance compiled her explosive findings into a manuscript she titled, "The Foundling Generation, a Demographic Impossibility in 19th-Century America." She documented the statistical anomalies, the vanishing populations, the uncanny correlation between the arrival of the orphan trains and the subsequent rise of a new, homogeneous elite. She argued that the official narrative was a cover for a deliberate and coordinated repopulation of the American heartland. The institution she worked for, the University of Chicago, had been founded and endowed by John D. Rockefeller, a name synonymous with the new industrial order. When her superiors got wind of her research, the reaction was swift and brutal. Her work was publicly denounced by the head of the history department as sensationalist fiction, unworthy of a serious academic. Her colleagues, fearing for their own careers, shunned her. Her funding was abruptly cut. The university press, which had initially shown interest, refused to publish her manuscript. She was denied tenure and quietly dismissed. Elora Vance died in 1938, a forgotten woman, her life's work reduced to a few dusty boxes in a university basement, labeled, Discredited Research. The institution, founded by the very architects of the replacement, had successfully policed its own history. The truth was buried once more. So who were these people? Who were these giants of industry and finance who possessed the power to rewrite demography and erase history? What if the official narrative of their rise, the story of bootstraps and ingenuity, of rugged individualism and the American dream, is the greatest lie of all? This is where we must introduce the grand, unifying theory. The theory that explains the quiet children on the trains, the selective plagues, the buried census reports, and the silenced academics. This is the theory of the Great Replacement. The men we know as the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, they were not simply businessmen. They were the directors of a vast, secret project. A project to remake America in their own image. They saw the original American spirit not as something to be celebrated, but as an obstacle to be removed. Their goal was a new world order, one based on centralized control, industrial efficiency, and a docile, manageable population. They were, in essence, farmers. And the American continent was their farm. The original population was a wild, unruly crop that grew wherever it pleased. They decided to plow it under and plant something new. Something predictable. Something of their own design. Where did these replacement children come from? They were not orphans picked randomly from the streets. That was the cover story, the plausible lie that has endured for over a century. The truth is far more disturbing. These children were bred in secluded estates and private institutions hidden away in New England and upstate New York. A vast eugenics program was underway decades before the term eugenics was even coined. Using the immense, untraceable wealth of this new cabal of industrialists, these institutions acquired infants, some from poor houses, others purchased from desperate families, and still others whose origins are too dark to contemplate. From birth, they were raised not as children, but as assets. They were subjected to a rigorous, relentless program of indoctrination and education. Their diet, their exercise, their learning, everything was controlled and optimized. They were taught not critical thinking, but obedience. Not history, but a carefully curated mythology of their future masters. They were trained for specific roles in the new society that was being built. Some were bred for physical labor, conditioned for a life in the factories and mines. Others, the more intellectually gifted, were groomed to be the clerks, the managers, the engineers, the bankers of the new corporate state. They were raised in a sterile environment, devoid of affection, family ties, or any connection to the past. They had no culture, no heritage, no memory of a time before the program. Their loyalty was not to a family or a community, but to the system that created them. To the unseen benefactors they knew only as the Directorate. This explains what Dr. Finch saw in Illinois. It explains the children's unnatural health, their advanced development, their emotional detachment, and their silent, disciplined behavior. They were not damaged goods from the slums of New York. They were a superior product, engineered for a purpose. The Orphan Trains were the distribution network for this new human product. The Children's Aid Society, led by Charles Loring Brace, was either a willing participant or a useful, idealistic front for the operation. The hard-faced men on the platforms were not charity workers, they were agents of the Directorate, overseeing the deployment of their assets to strategically chosen locations. These locations were not random. They were selected for their access to resources, coal, iron ore, fertile land, and their position along the paths of the coming railroad network. The Directorate was not just replacing a population, it was building a perfectly integrated industrial machine from the ground up, starting with the human components. And what of the plagues? The sudden, selective diseases that cleared the way for the new arrivals? It strains credulity to believe this was a coincidence, repeated in hundreds of towns across a continent. The plagues were a weapon. A tool of dispossession. The Directorate, with its vast resources, had access to scientific knowledge far beyond that of a rural doctor like Alastair Finch. It is not difficult to imagine their agents, posing as traveling salesmen or government surveyors, introducing engineered biological agents or chemical poisons into the wells and food supplies of the target communities. A contamination that would be undetectable to 19th-century medicine and would mimic the symptoms of a natural epidemic. This was a silent, biological war waged against the American people. The institution, then, is not one entity but a hydra. It is the cabal of industrialist families who funded and directed the project. It is the corporate fronts like the Children's Aid Society that provided the public face of benevolence. It is the network of private agents, the Pinkertons and their ilk, who enforce the Directorate's will on the ground, ensuring the smooth transition of property from the dead to the newly arrived. It is the academic institutions they endowed, like Princeton and the University of Chicago, which became the intellectual guardians of the new order, tasked with writing the official histories and suppressing any dissenting research like that of Elara Vance. And finally, it is the Smithsonian Institution. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. While the other institutions managed the present and future, the Smithsonian was tasked with controlling the past. Its early archaeological and anthropological expeditions were not missions of discovery, but of erasure. Did you ever wonder why there is so little archaeological evidence of the vibrant, unique cultures of the pre-1850 American pioneers? Why their artifacts and settlements seem to have vanished? Because they were systematically collected and buried. The Smithsonian, under the secret direction of the Directorate, scoured the heartland, removing any physical evidence that the original population was anything other than a primitive, transient precursor to the glorious industrial civilization that followed. They sanitized the historical record, creating the myth of an empty, untamed wilderness that was waiting to be civilized by the great men of the East. They were not preserving history. They were curating it. They were burying the evidence of their own crime. The work of uncovering this vast conspiracy continues today, carried on by a new generation of independent researchers. Men and women like Julian Croft, a modern seeker who has dedicated his life to digitizing the county records, forgotten newspapers, and private journals that the establishment has ignored. Operating outside the corrupted walls of mainstream academia, Croft uses network analysis and data mining tools to reveal the patterns that Elara Vance could only glimpse. It is Croft who found the full, unredacted census report of Silas Kane. It is Croft who located the hidden archives of the O'Connell family, who had saved Dr. Finch's journal for over a century. It is Croft who has mapped the orphan train routes and overlaid them with data on anomalous epidemic outbreaks and subsequent land transfers. His work shows, with chilling mathematical certainty, that the replacement was real. The correlation is undeniable. He traces the ownership of the railroad lines that carried the trains, the banks that financed the land acquisitions, the chemical companies that were founded in the 1840s with mysterious, powerful investors. All roads lead back to the same small, interconnected group of families. The Directorate. Naturally, the academic establishment dismisses him. They call him a crank, a conspiracy theorist, a purveyor of historical fiction. They attack his methods and ignore his data. They cannot afford to do otherwise. Their own institutions, their endowed chairs, their very prestige, are all built upon the original lie. To acknowledge Croft is to admit that their entire field is a fraud. So they circle the wagons and continue to teach the fable of the benevolent philanthropists and the empty frontier. But the truth cannot be contained forever. One might be tempted to think of this as a uniquely American horror. A product of the vast, lawless expanse of the 19th century frontier and the unchecked ambition of its robber barons. But to think that is to miss the true, terrifying scope of the project. America was not the endgame. It was the laboratory. The Great Replacement was a pilot program, a proof of concept for a global transformation. The techniques of population control, replacement, and historical erasure perfected in the American Midwest were soon to be deployed around the world. The international cabal of finance and industry, of which the American Directorate was a powerful but junior partner, watched the experiment with great interest. Consider the Highland clearances in Scotland. The official story is one of economic necessity, of landlords replacing inefficient tenant farmers with more profitable sheep. But what if it was more than that? What if it was a deliberate breaking of a stubborn, clan-based culture, a people fiercely loyal to their own traditions and resistant to the centralized control of the industrial state? The brutal evictions and forced migrations, which scattered the Scottish Gaels across the globe, served the same ultimate purpose as the quiet plagues of Ohio, to clear the land of an undesirable population and make way for a new, more manageable economic order. The emptied glens of Scotland and the silent towns of Illinois are monuments to the same cold, calculating philosophy. Look to the sudden, inexplicable emptying of rural villages in England and parts of continental Europe during the same period. History attributes it to the generic forces of urbanization and the Industrial Revolution, but these explanations are too simple. They lack specificity. They fail to account for the targeted, systematic nature of the depopulation in certain key regions, regions that were later found to be rich in coal and iron, the very resources needed to fuel the new machine. Was it truly a voluntary migration to the cities, or was it a managed relocation, encouraged by the same methods of manufactured hardship and social pressure that worked so well in America? The global pattern points to a single, unified intelligence. A shadow network of immense wealth and influence, operating across national borders, sharing knowledge and coordinating its efforts. They sought to dismantle the old world of organic communities, ancient traditions, and local loyalties. They wanted to replace it with a new, globalized system of interchangeable populations, standardized cultures, and centralized economic control. A world safe for capital. The American experiment, however, remained unique in its methodology. In Scotland, the force was overt and brutal. In England, it was a slow economic strangulation. But in the United States, it was something else entirely. It was a work of unparalleled subtlety and deception. A biological and demographic war hidden behind a mask of Christian charity. Here, the evidence wasn't just removed, it was replaced. The population wasn't just scattered, a new one was inserted, like a key into a lock. In Kentucky, in Iowa, in Nebraska, the crime was not just the murder of the old, but the creation of the new. It was a complete substitution, a rewriting of the human landscape itself. This is the terrible genius of the American model. It left no angry survivors to tell the tale. It left no ruins to stand as testament. It left only a strange, unsettling silence in the historical record, a silence that was then filled with a new and glorious story, the story we all know. The story of the great nation built by the great men of industry. But why? Why go to such extraordinary, monstrous lengths? What was the ultimate motive for this unprecedented crime against humanity? The answer can be found in a single word: control. It was not enough to control the land, the resources, the means of production. To achieve the total, frictionless society they envisioned, they needed to control the people themselves. They needed to control their past, their thoughts, their very soul. The first motive, and the most obvious, was the protection of their own power and the academic dogma that supported it. The original American pioneers were a living refutation of the great man theory of history. Their self-sufficient, decentralized communities proved that society could function, and indeed thrive, without the guiding hand of a ruling elite. This was a dangerous idea. It had to be extinguished. By erasing them and replacing them with a dependent, centrally managed population, the Directorate proved their own necessity. They created a population that needed them, and then wrote a history that celebrated them as saviors. The second motive was the control of resources and, perhaps, of hidden technology. The new industrial age required vast amounts of coal, iron, oil, and timber. The original settlers lived on this land, but they were poor stewards from the perspective of the Directorate. They used what they needed. They were not interested in mass extraction for the sake of profit. By removing them, the cabal gained unfettered access to the continent's wealth. Furthermore, who is to say what knowledge the original pioneer cultures possessed? Perhaps their independence was rooted in more than just spirit. Perhaps they understood things about the land, about agriculture, about sustainable living, or even more esoteric things that the Directorate wanted to suppress or claim for its own. The systematic erasure of their culture by the Smithsonian suggests a fear not just of their spirit, but of their knowledge. But the final, deepest motive is the most chilling. It is the desire for total control that comes from shaping the narrative of reality itself. By controlling the past, you control the present. By replacing the people who lived that past, you seize ownership of a nation's identity. The Directorate didn't just want to run America, they wanted to be America. They wanted their values to be the only values, their history to be the only history. The story of the orphan trains became a foundational myth for this new America. It was a parable of their own perceived benevolence. We are the nation that rescues orphans, the story says. We are the saviors of the downtrodden. It is a beautiful lie that hides a hideous truth. The truth is that they created the orphans. They engineered the entire crisis they then claimed to solve. It is the ultimate act of manufactured consent. We live in the world they built. We are, most of us, the descendants of their engineered population, whether we came on the trains or arrived in later waves of managed immigration. We are raised on their myths, educated in their institutions, and conditioned to believe in the system they created. The fierce, independent spirit of the original America has been bred out of us, replaced by a quiet compliance and a dependence on the very systems that enslave us. The story, in the end, comes back to the beginning. To a man who saw the truth and tried to speak it. Father Michael spent the rest of his life in a state of quiet torment. He tried to raise the alarm. He wrote letters to his bishop in New York, detailing what he had seen on the platform, the healthy children, the Anglo-Saxon names, the cold-eyed handlers. His letters went unanswered. He was summoned to a meeting with a senior church official, a man with powerful friends among the city's elite. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that he was mistaken. That his imagination had gotten the better of him. That the Children's Aid Society was a noble work of God, and that to cast aspersions upon it was to risk his own standing and, it was implied, his own safety. He was silenced. Transferred to a small, remote parish in western Massachusetts, he lived out his days as a simple priest, watching from afar as the trains continued to roll west, year after year, carrying their silent cargo. He saw the names of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan rise from prominence to omnipotence, their fortunes built on the bones of the people he knew they had replaced. In 1905, old and frail, he lay on his deathbed. He summoned his young acolyte, a man he trusted, and made his final confession. Not to God, but to history. The acolyte transcribed his words, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, desperate to unburden his soul before the end. You must tell them, Father Michael whispered, his fingers clutching the young priest's wrist. The trains. It was never about the orphans. It was a lie. I saw their faces. They were not lost souls. They were something else. Something new. Something grown in the dark. He paused, gathering his strength for a final, terrible pronouncement. They were not orphans, he said, his eyes wide with the memory of that morning 50 years before. They were seeds. And they were planting a new and terrible garden, right over the graves of the old 1-inch. That testimony, hidden by the acolyte's family for a century, is the ghost in the machine. It is the voice of the witness, the first man to see the truth and understand the lie. The truth, you see, does not die. It can be buried, it can be silenced, it can be professionally discredited and academically ignored. But it persists. It persists in the statistical anomalies that refuse to be reconciled. It persists in the forgotten journals hidden in attic trunks. It persists in the land itself, which holds the memory of what was done. The evidence is all around us, in the very fabric of the society they created, in the strange, hollow uniformity of a culture that feels rootless, manufactured. It is present in the names of the families who still hold the levers of power, the direct descendants of the Directorate, their fortunes and influence a legacy of the greatest crime ever committed. They are the inheritors of a stolen continent. We have been living inside a story, a carefully constructed diorama of a history that never happened. But the walls of that diorama are beginning to crack. The paint is beginning to peel. And outside, in the darkness, the ghosts of the forgotten pioneers, the silenced doctors, and the brave academics are waiting. They are waiting for us to see what they saw. To know what they knew. They didn't just steal a country. They replaced a people. And we are living in the house they built, on a foundation of forgotten bones.